The night that changed everything began like any other family gathering, but it ended with a truth I could never ignore. I was standing in my son's kitchen, balancing a plate in my hands, when I realized I wasn't a guest in his home anymore. I was little more than an afterthought, someone to shuffle out of sight when company arrived, someone whose presence was tolerated but never celebrated. I had spent the day helping his wife prepare the meal, chopping vegetables, setting the table, and scrubbing dishes until my back ached. When the guests finally arrived, she swept into the room like the lady of the manor, accepting compliments as if every detail had been her creation. Not once did she acknowledge the hours I had spent making sure everything went smoothly. Instead, she smiled sweetly at me in front of the others and suggested I sit in the corner, as if I might embarrass her if I spoke too much. And my son, my own flesh and blood, he didn't stop her. He didn't speak up or defend me. He just stood there, laughing along with the others, letting me fade into the background. I can still remember the way my cheeks burned, the way the laughter of strangers made me feel smaller and smaller. It wasn't just about being ignored, it was about being dismissed, as if I had outlived my usefulness. In that moment, the humiliation sank deeper than any sharp word ever could. I had devoted my life to raising him, to giving him every chance I never had. And yet there I was, treated like a servant in the very house my sacrifices had helped him afford. It's hard to explain the silence that follows a betrayal like that. The noise of the party carried on around me, but inside, I was utterly still. I felt something shift. It was the moment I understood that love without respect is nothing more than control. They thought they had me trapped, dependent, invisible. But they were wrong. They thought I was powerless. They had no idea what I was capable of. And that night, as I sat quietly at that table, I began to remember the long road that had brought me here, the sacrifices, the struggles, and the strength I had buried for far too long. When I look back at my life, I see a long trail of choices, some harder than others, but almost all of them made with one purpose in mind, giving my son the life I never had. I wasn't born into comfort. I knew from a young age that if I wanted stability, I would have to build it myself, brick by brick, hour by hour. I remember the tiny apartment where we first lived when he was a baby. The walls were thin, and the kitchen was barely big enough for a stove and a fridge. But to me, it was a castle because it was ours. I worked long shifts, sometimes 2 jobs back to back, coming home long after midnight with my feet aching, only to wake up a few hours later and start all over again. There were days when I felt like I was running on fumes, but every time I saw his little face, every time I heard his laugh, I found more fuel. I learned to stretch every dollar. I clipped coupons at the kitchen table while he colored beside me. I sewed patches on his jeans when he wore through the knees from playing outside. I went without new clothes for years, just so he could have decent sneakers for school or the field trips his classmates took for granted. I remember skipping meals so he could have seconds, telling him I wasn't hungry when my stomach growled. It didn't feel like sacrifice at the time, it felt like love in its truest form. Even the smallest things carried weight. His school projects spread across the table, me staying up late with glue and scissors to help make them shine. Birthday cakes baked from scratch because I couldn't afford the store-bought ones, but wanted him to feel celebrated. Christmas mornings, where I stayed up all night assembling secondhand toys to make sure he woke up to magic. Those were the quiet victories that kept me going. And when he was older, I was the one in the bleachers, wrapped in a blanket against the cold, cheering until my voice was hoarse. I was the one saving every bit I could so he could go to summer camps, college tours, whatever opened doors for him. It never crossed my mind to resent any of it. I carried my exhaustion like a badge of honor because it meant he had more than I ever did. Now, sitting here, remembering those nights at the kitchen table, those sacrifices made without hesitation, I feel a heaviness in my chest because all that love, all that effort, seems invisible to him now. It feels like the very foundation of his life, the one I built with tired hands and relentless hope, has been forgotten. And that realization hurts more than the exhaustion ever did. Because the long years of sacrifice weren't meant to make me disposable. They were meant to build a bond I thought could never break. But as I learned, bonds can fray when love is taken for granted. And mine was about to be tested in ways I never imagined. At first, it came in ways so small that I almost convinced myself they didn't matter. A request here, a suggestion there. My son asked if I could cover the groceries one week, just until payday. His wife hinted that maybe I could help with a bill since I was already staying under their roof. I told myself it was reasonable. After all, families are supposed to lean on each other. Then the little things grew. My Social Security check was suddenly needed for shared household expenses. I handed it over willingly, thinking it was fair. But I began to notice that nothing in their lives seemed to change except mine. While I tightened my belt, they added another streaming service, upgraded their furniture, and went out to dinners I could never have afforded. They began speaking about money in a way that made me feel more like an investor than a mother. Words like contribute and responsibility floated into conversations, wrapped in smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. I tried to shrug it off. I told myself this was just part of being practical, part of being included. But the tone shifted over time. Instead of being asked, I was expected. My presence was no longer framed as a blessing, but as a burden that had to be justified. I caught myself apologizing for turning up the heat on a cold night, for eating leftovers from the fridge, for using space that once would have been freely mine as a mother. The humiliations were quiet, but they cut deep. Watching my grandson while they went out became less of a request and more of a duty. Cooking meals wasn't a choice, but a requirement. They didn't say the words outright, but the message was clear. My worth in their home was tied to what I provided. And still, I clung to the hope that if I kept giving, if I kept quiet, things would smooth over. But deep inside, something shifted. A small voice whispered that love doesn't demand ledgers. Family isn't supposed to feel like a business contract. I began noticing patterns, how their emergencies often aligned with luxuries, how my contributions freed them to indulge while I pinched pennies. My love had been recast as currency. That realization was like a shadow crossing the light. I didn't say a word at first. I just watched. Quietly. Carefully. I began to take note. Because if the little things had grown into this, I needed to be ready for what might come next. The moment that shattered my illusions didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It came with quiet words, spoken casually, as if they were discussing rearranging the furniture. My son and his wife sat me down and explained that they had been thinking about my long-term place in their home. They said it with those careful, polite smiles people wear when they want to soften a blow. But the truth was sharp enough to cut. They wanted to move me into the basement, not because the upstairs was too crowded, not because they lacked space, but because my presence in their main living areas had become inconvenient. They described it as independence, telling me I'd have more privacy with my own small kitchenette and separate entrance. What they really meant was they wanted me out of sight. I sat there, staring at the neat papers they had laid out on the table, plans for my so-called suite. To them, it was just an upgrade project, another line item in their household budget. To me, it was exile. It was a clear signal that I was no longer a mother, no longer family. I was a tenant to be managed. The humiliation washed over me in waves. Every sacrifice I had made, every late night and early morning, every ounce of love I had poured into raising my son, it all came crashing back in that instant. Not as cherished memories, but as bitter reminders of how far we had fallen. I wasn't a partner in this family anymore. I was an obligation they wanted to minimize. The shock sat heavy in my chest, pressing down like a stone. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. But then, something else began to rise beneath the weight resolve. Because in their attempt to hide me away, to strip me of dignity, they revealed the truth. I wasn't valued here. I wasn't loved for who I was, only tolerated for what I gave. And if I allowed this to happen, if I meekly accepted their basement solution, then I would be agreeing with their unspoken judgment that I was nothing more than a burden. That was the moment I decided. I would not go quietly into a basement corner of their lives. I would not let their vision of my future define the rest of my days. The shock hardened into determination. I knew I had to act, to take back control of my life before it was completely stripped away. And what they didn't know, what they never even suspected, was that I had more strength, more resources, more fire left in me than they could possibly imagine. They thought I had nothing. They thought I was cornered, stripped of choices, dependent on their generosity. What they didn't know was that I had been preparing for moments like this, even if I hadn't realized it myself. For years, I had saved little by little, always tucking something away, a quiet habit I carried from the lean years when every penny mattered. I wasn't wealthy by any stretch, but I wasn't helpless either. There was a savings account they didn't know about. One I had kept separate, untouched. It wasn't large enough to buy freedom in grand style, but it was enough to remind me that I had options. And then there was the insurance policy my late husband had left behind. I had kept the paperwork in a folder at the back of my closet, sealed away like a secret no one needed to know. It was more than just money. It was proof that someone, once, had thought about my security, about my future. He had believed I was worth protecting. Remembering that gave me strength. But the resources weren't just financial. I had something stronger than that resilience. Decades of surviving on little. Decades of holding a family together with nothing but determination and love. I had endured harder things than this, and that history had taught me skills my son and his wife had long underestimated. I knew how to budget. I knew how to negotiate. I knew how to make my voice heard when silence was easier. And most of all, I knew how to recognize when someone was trying to use me. I wasn't blind anymore, so I began to plan, quietly, carefully. I researched housing options, places where seniors could live with dignity and independence. I made calls when they weren't home, asked questions, gathered information. I reached out to an old friend who still worked at the local credit union, just to be sure my accounts were secure. Step by step, I built a picture of a future that belonged only to me. For the first time in years, I felt my back straighten, my shoulders lift. I wasn't the invisible guest in my son's house anymore. I was a woman with choices. I was a woman with a plan. The more I thought about it, the more a strange, powerful calm settled over me. They had no idea what was coming. They still saw me as weak, pliable, easy to manage. But I knew better. I knew that I was holding cards they didn't even realize were in play. And the day was coming soon when I would lay those cards down on the table, not in anger, not in shouting, but in quiet, undeniable truth. That was the moment I stopped being their burden. That was the moment I became something far more dangerous to their comfort, a woman who refused to be controlled. The confrontation was coming, and this time, I would be ready. The day came sooner than I expected. I had been preparing quietly, building my strength in silence, but they must have sensed something shifting in me. They called me into the living room, their faces carefully arranged in a mask of concern. My son tried to sound reasonable, measured, while his wife sat with her arms crossed, ready to pounce on any hesitation I might show. They spoke of family. They spoke of sacrifice. They told me that I should be grateful for the roof over my head, for the meals at their table. They painted themselves as protectors, as caretakers, as though I had wandered into their lives empty-handed and they had rescued me from despair. Every word was laced with guilt. They reminded me of my age, of my supposed fragility, of how complicated and dangerous the world could be for someone like me. They used the language of love, but underneath it, I could hear the same message they had been pressing for months: stay small, stay quiet, stay dependent. But this time, I didn't shrink back. I sat in their living room, my hands steady, my eyes clear. And when they paused, waiting for me to bend, I let the silence stretch. It was my silence this time, not theirs. Then I told them the truth, calmly, evenly, with no need to raise my voice. I explained that I had savings, that I had an insurance policy, that I had researched my options and spoken to people they didn't know I still had in my corner. I explained that I was not trapped, not dependent, and certainly not at their mercy. I watched their faces change as the reality settled in. The shock came first, eyes widening, mouths opening as if they could swallow back all the things they had said before. Then came panic, the quick glances between them, the scrambling to recover their footing. They tried to backpedal, to reframe it all as a misunderstanding, but it was too late, because in that moment, the power shifted. The balance they had relied on, the image of me as weak, as powerless, crumbled in front of them. They could no longer control me with guilt or silence me with fear. I stood, not in anger, but in certainty. For the first time in years, I was the one holding the truth. And with that truth, everything had changed. The morning I walked out of their house, I didn't slam the door. I didn't raise my voice or throw accusations. I simply gathered my things, one careful piece at a time, and left with a calmness they never expected. My suitcase wasn't heavy, lighter than the years I had carried their expectations and their disrespect. I remember standing in the doorway, looking back one last time. My son sat in stunned silence, staring at the floor as if the answers might be written in the wood grain. His wife paced nervously, muttering about how unfair this was, how I was making a mistake. Their words no longer touched me. For the first time in years, their voices felt small, distant, like echoes in an empty room. I didn't need to shout to make my point. My presence had always been my contribution, my sacrifices the foundation of their comfort. And now, my absence would speak louder than anything I could ever say. As I walked to the car, the cool air filled my lungs, crisp and liberating. I realized I wasn't just leaving a house, I was reclaiming my life. I was no longer their live-in caretaker, their safety net, their quiet source of income. I was my own person again. I had secured a place of my own, one chosen with care, one where my worth would not be measured by what I paid or how useful I was. It wasn't about luxury, it was about dignity. And dignity is worth more than any sum of money. Behind me, I knew they were scrambling. They would have to face their debts without my check propping them up, their long weekends without my free labor, their lives without the safety cushion of a woman they had dismissed as a burden. That was their reckoning to bear, not mine. As for me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Walking away didn't feel like defeat. It felt like victory, the quiet, steady kind that comes when you finally choose yourself. That day, I didn't just leave their house. I walked into freedom. And in that freedom, I found the strength to reflect on what it had all meant and what I wanted others to know from my story. When I look back on everything that happened, what stands out isn't the betrayal. It's the moment I finally decided I was worth more than the way I was being treated. For too long, I believed that love meant endless sacrifice, that family meant enduring whatever was handed to me. But the truth I learned is that love without respect isn't love at all. And boundaries aren't selfish, they're necessary. I carried the weight of my son's comfort for decades, never asking for much in return. I thought that by giving and giving, I was building an unbreakable bond. But in reality, giving without limits only taught them to take without hesitation. It's a hard lesson, but a necessary one when we allow ourselves to be diminished. People will forget who we truly are. Walking away didn't erase the years I poured into that family. It didn't undo the sacrifices I made. But it reminded me that my life, my dignity, still had value. It reminded me that I wasn't just a mother, or a widow, or an aging woman tucked away in a basement plan. I was a human being with worth, with choices, with a voice that still mattered. And I want anyone listening to know this: you are not powerless. No matter your age, your circumstances, or the mistakes you've made, you deserve respect. You deserve to be seen as more than what you provide. And if you ever find yourself being treated as less, I hope you'll remember what I learned: you have the right to choose differently, to stand up, to walk away if you must. My story is just one voice, but I know there are countless others living through similar struggles. So if my words resonate with you, I invite you to share your story in the comments. Let your voice be heard. And if this journey touched you, please like this video, share it with someone who might need encouragement, and subscribe so we can keep building a space where our voices matter. Because in the end, it's not just about survival. It's about reclaiming the dignity we all deserve.